What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actresses finds herself blindsided by a talk show host who seems more interested in creating controversy than conducting a real interview? Tonight, we're diving deep into the explosive confrontation that had everyone talking, where what started as a routine promotional appearance turned into a verbal battlefield that ended with one of the most dramatic walk-offs in late-night television history. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story has layers that will shock you. The Late Show's studio audience was buzzing with anticipation as Natalie Portman made her entrance, waving gracefully to the crowd before settling into the guest chair across from Steve Colbert. She was there to promote her latest film, a psychological thriller that had been generating serious Oscar buzz. The actress looked radiant in a sleek black blazer, her trademark poise evident as she crossed her legs and flashed that famous smile that had charmed the audiences for decades. Colbert, known for his sharp wit and political commentary, seemed unusually intense that evening. His researchers had clearly been digging, and there was something in his demeanor that suggested this wouldn't be the typical promotional softball interview that most celebrities expect when they visit late-night shows. The audience sensed it, too. There was an electric tension in the air that made everyone lean forward in their seats. "Natalie, welcome back to the show," Colbert began, his voice carrying an edge that seemed to cut through the studio's warm lighting. "I have to say, your new film is quite the departure from your previous work. It deals with some heavy themes about power dynamics in Hollywood." "Very timely, wouldn't you say?" Portman nodded, clearly prepared for questions about the film's subject matter. "Thank you for having me, Steve. Yes, it's a project I'm incredibly passionate about. We wanted to explore the complex relationships between authority figures and those who work under them, the psychological manipulation that can occur, and how people find their voice in difficult situations." But Colbert wasn't interested in letting her stick to the talking points. His next question came like a curveball, delivered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Speaking of finding your voice, there's been quite a bit of discussion online about your own experiences in the industry. Some people are questioning whether your advocacy for women's rights in Hollywood is genuine, or if it's more of a convenient stance for someone who's already established and successful." The studio fell silent. This wasn't the direction anyone expected the interview to take, least of all Portman herself. Her media training kicked in immediately, but you could see the surprise flash across her face before she composed herself. "I'm not sure I understand what you're implying, Steve. My commitment to supporting women in this industry comes from personal experience and genuine belief in equality." Colbert leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he pressed forward. "But isn't it interesting how your activism became much more vocal after you'd already achieved tremendous success? Critics might say it's easy to speak out when you're no longer vulnerable, when you don't need to worry about your next job or your career trajectory." The accusation hung in the air, like smoke. Portman's jaw tightened slightly, though she maintained her composure. "Steve, I think you're oversimplifying a very complex issue. Many of us who speak out now do so because we finally have the platform and the security to do it, without fear of retaliation. That doesn't make our commitment any less genuine." "But doesn't that prove my point exactly?" Colbert shot back, his voice rising slightly. "You waited until it was safe, until it was profitable even, to take a stand. Meanwhile, countless women without your privilege were suffering in silence because they didn't have your advantages." The audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't comedy, this wasn't entertainment. This was a full-scale interrogation disguised as an interview. Portman's publicist, sitting in the wings, looked like she was about to have a heart attack. "I find it deeply unfair that you're attacking me for using my platform responsibly," Portman replied, her voice steady but with steel underneath. No one speaks out in a vacuum, Steve. We all make calculations about timing and impact. That's not opportunism, that's strategy. Colbert's smile turned predatory. Strategy? That's an interesting choice of words. So you admit this is calculated? That your public persona as a feminist advocate is part of a larger strategy to maintain relevance in an industry that's increasingly focused on social justice messaging. The question was so loaded, so deliberately inflammatory, that even some audience members began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Portman sat back slightly, as if she'd been physically pushed. Are you seriously suggesting that my entire career and personal beliefs are some kind of elaborate performance? That's not just insulting to me, it's insulting to every woman who's ever fought for equality in this industry. I'm not suggesting anything, Colbert replied with mock innocence. I'm simply asking questions that I think the public deserves answers to. You've made millions of dollars. You've won awards. You've achieved everything most actors dream of. And now you want us to see you as some kind of crusader for the downtrodden? It's a convenient narrative, don't you think? Portman's composure finally began to crack. Her voice took on a harder edge as she leaned forward in her chair. What exactly are you trying to accomplish here, Steve? Because this feels less like journalism and more like a personal attack disguised as an interview. I'm trying to have an honest conversation, Colbert responded, though his tone suggested anything but honesty. Something that seems to be in short supply in Hollywood these days. Everyone's so concerned with maintaining their image, their brand, that we rarely get to see who these people really are, underneath all the carefully crafted messaging. The irony of his statement wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. Here was Colbert, supposedly championing honesty and authenticity, while conducting what appeared to be a calculated ambush of his guest. The hypocrisy was staggering, but he seemed completely oblivious to it. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. Portman took a deep breath, clearly trying to regain her center. Steve, I came here to talk about my film, about art, about storytelling. If you want to have a serious conversation about activism and authenticity in Hollywood, I'm happy to do that. But what you're doing right now feels more like you're trying to create a viral moment at my expense. Colbert's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Everything's about viral moments now, isn't it? Even your response is perfectly calibrated for social media. Steve Colbert attacks innocent actress. That's the headline you're going for, right? The accusation was so baseless, so clearly designed to provoke, that several audience members actually gasped. Portman's eyes flashed with genuine anger for the first time since the interview began. You're putting words in my mouth and thoughts in my head that simply aren't there. This is exactly the kind of hostile environment that makes it difficult for people to speak honestly about important issues. Hostile environment, Colbert repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. This is a talk show, Natalie, not a courtroom. Although I suppose when you're used to everyone treating you with kid gloves, actual questions might feel like an attack. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable now. Whatever had motivated this line of questioning, whether it was a desire for controversy, personal animosity, or simply bad judgment, Colbert had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The interview had devolved from uncomfortable to genuinely ugly, and everyone in the studio could feel it. What made everything worse was that Colbert seemed to be enjoying himself. There was a glint in his eye that suggested he knew exactly how far he was pushing, and he was relishing every uncomfortable moment. The studio cameras continued rolling, capturing every micro-expression, every pause, every moment of tension that would later be dissected, frame by frame across social media platforms. You know what's fascinating to me, Colbert continued, his voice taking on an almost professorial tone, is how you've managed to position yourself as both a victim and a hero in the same narrative. You've suffered in silence, but you're also brave enough to speak out. You've been powerless, but you're also incredibly influential. It's quite the balancing act. Portman's hands gripped the arms of her chair slightly tighter. Steve, I think you're deliberately mischaracterizing my positions to create conflict where none exists. I've never claimed to be a victim or a hero. I've simply shared my experiences and tried to use whatever influence I have to support positive change. But that's just it. Colbert pressed on, clearly not interested in her clarification. Your experiences? Let's talk about those. You've been in this industry since you were a child. You've worked with some of the most powerful people in Hollywood, and yet your public statements about inappropriate behavior and abuse have been, notably, general, vague even. The implication was clear, and it was ugly. Portman's face went pale, and for a moment she seemed genuinely speechless. The audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something that had crossed the line from uncomfortable television into something approaching character assassination. Are you asking me to name names? Portman asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Are you asking me to violate confidences and potentially expose people to legal action for the sake of your television show? I'm asking you to be honest, Colbert replied, his voice rising. You want to be seen as an advocate, but you're not willing to take the risks that real advocacy requires. You want the credit without the consequences. The cruelty of the statement was breathtaking. Here was a man with his own late-night television show, his own platform, his own security, attacking a woman for not being willing to potentially destroy her career and open herself up to legal retaliation. The hypocrisy was staggering, but Colbert seemed completely oblivious to it. Portman stood up slightly in her chair as if she was preparing to leave, but then seemed to think better of it. Steve, I have to ask, what is this really about? Because this feels personal in a way that goes beyond journalism or entertainment. Have I done something to offend you? Have I said something that upset you? For just a moment, Colbert's mask slipped. There was something raw and almost wounded in his expression, but it was gone so quickly that most viewers probably missed it. This isn't about me, Natalie. This is about accountability. This is about whether celebrities who claim to care about important issues are willing to put their money where their mouth is. And what exactly would satisfy you? Portman asked, her voice now carrying an edge of desperation. What would I have to do to prove to you that my commitment is genuine? Destroy my career? Burn every bridge I've ever built? Risk everything I've worked for? Maybe, Colbert said simply, and the word hung in the air like a sword. Maybe that's what real activism looks like. Maybe that's what real courage requires. The studio audience was now visibly uncomfortable. Several people were shifting in their seats, looking at each other with expressions of disbelief. This had gone so far beyond the bounds of normal television that many seemed unsure whether they should be watching at all. Portman's voice, when she spoke again, was steady but filled with controlled anger. So in your mind, the only way to prove that I genuinely care about women's rights is to destroy myself in the process. The only way to validate my activism is to become a martyr. I'm not asking you to become a martyr, Colbert replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. I'm asking you to be consistent. You can't have it both ways. You can't claim to be fighting for change while simultaneously protecting the system that enabled the problems in the first place. What system am I protecting? Portman demanded, her composure finally beginning to crack in earnest. By being strategic about how and when I speak out, by trying to create sustainable change rather than burning everything down in a moment of righteous anger? The system that made you rich and famous, Colbert shot back. The system that you've benefited from for decades. The system that you're now critiquing from a position of safety and privilege. The accusation was so reductive, so deliberately inflammatory, that even Portman seemed stunned by its audacity. You're describing every single person who's ever worked in this industry, Steve, including you. You've also benefited from the entertainment industry. You've also achieved success and security. By your logic, that disqualifies you from criticizing anything about how business is conducted in Hollywood. But Colbert wasn't interested in logical consistency. The difference is, I'm not claiming to be a crusader for social justice. I'm not positioning myself as the voice of the voiceless. I'm just a comedian with a talk show. A comedian who's currently using his platform to attack a guest for not being activist enough, Portman replied, her voice rising for the first time. A comedian who's decided that the best use of his television show is to tear down someone who's actually trying to make a difference. The exchange was becoming genuinely heated now, with both participants leaning forward in their chairs, their voices carrying across the studio. The audience was completely silent, watching what felt less like an interview and more like a public execution. Colbert's next words were delivered with surgical precision, clearly designed to inflict maximum damage. You know what I think, Natalie? I think you've gotten so comfortable being praised for your activism that you've forgotten what real activism actually costs. You've turned social justice into a brand, and now you're upset that someone is questioning the authenticity of your brand. The accusation was so personal, so calculated to wound, that Portman actually recoiled as if she'd been slapped. Her face went through a series of emotions in rapid succession: surprise, hurt, anger, and finally something that looked almost like betrayal. "That's not just unfair, Steve. That's cruel," she said quietly. "And it's beneath you. Or at least, I thought it was." "Truth is often cruel," Colbert replied, seemingly unmoved by her obvious distress. "But it's still truth. You've built a career on being likable, on being the good girl who says the right things at the right time. But when push comes to shove, when real sacrifice is required, where are you?" "I'm right here," Portman replied, her voice now shaking slightly with emotion. "I'm sitting in this chair, trying to have a conversation with someone who seems determined to mischaracterize everything I say and do. I'm trying to engage with someone who's apparently decided that the only way to prove my integrity is to destroy myself. And that right there is the problem," Colbert said, his voice taking on an almost triumphant tone. "You think having this conversation is some kind of sacrifice. You think being challenged on your positions is persecution. You've gotten so used to being handled with kid gloves that you can't handle actual scrutiny." The cruelty of his words was matched only by the satisfaction in his voice. He was clearly enjoying watching her squirm, enjoying the power dynamic that allowed him to attack while she was forced to defend. It was exactly the kind of behavior that his supposed activism claimed to oppose. But the irony seemed completely lost on him. Portman sat back in her chair, looking drained and defeated. "Steve, I have to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you actually believe what you're saying right now? Do you really think that what you're doing here tonight is journalism, or are you just trying to create a moment that will get people talking?" For the first time since the interview began, Colbert seemed genuinely caught off guard by her question. His confident demeanor faltered slightly, and for a moment he looked almost uncertain. But Colbert's moment of uncertainty lasted only seconds before his defenses kicked back in, harder than ever. "What I'm doing," he said, his voice now carrying a defensive edge, "is asking the questions that other interviewers are too starstruck or too polite to ask. What I'm doing is holding people accountable for their public statements and their public personas." "By ambushing me?" Portman asked, her voice now carrying a note of incredulity. "By attacking my character and my motivations without any evidence. By turning what was supposed to be a promotional interview into a personal inquisition." "I'm not ambushing anyone," Colbert insisted, though his tone suggested he knew how thin his justification sounded. These are legitimate questions about public figures who use their platforms to advocate for social causes. The public has a right to know whether these positions are genuine or performative. Portman shook her head slowly, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Steve, let me ask you something. Have you ever donated money to causes you believe in without publicizing it? Have you ever helped someone without making sure people knew about it? Have you ever done the right thing simply because it was right, not because it would benefit your image or your career? The questions hung in the air, and for the first time all evening, Colbert seemed genuinely uncomfortable. His usual quick wit seemed to abandon him as he struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't sound completely hypocritical. "This isn't about me," he finally said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Of course it's about you," Portman replied, her voice gaining strength. "You're the one asking these questions. You're the one making these accusations. You're the one who's decided that I need to prove my worth to you and your audience. So I think it's fair to ask what gives you the authority to make those judgments." The tables had turned, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Suddenly, Colbert was the one on the defensive, and he didn't like it. His face flushed slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of anger that hadn't been there before. "I have a television show and a platform," he said. "That gives me the right to ask questions. That's literally what I'm paid to do." "No," Portman said, firmly. "What you're paid to do is entertain people and maybe inform them a little bit in the process. What you're doing right now is using your platform to tear down someone who came here in good faith to talk about their work. There's a difference between asking tough questions and conducting a character assassination." The word assassination seemed to hit Colbert like a physical blow. His eyes flashed with anger, and when he spoke again, his voice was colder than it had been all evening. "Character assassination," he repeated. "That's what you're calling this? I'm asking you to defend positions that you've taken publicly, statements that you've made in interviews and on social media. If you can't handle being asked to explain your own words, maybe you shouldn't be making public statements at all." "My own words?" Portman's voice rose in genuine outrage. "Steve, you haven't quoted a single thing I've actually said tonight. You've paraphrased, you've interpreted, you've put words in my mouth, but you haven't once asked me to clarify or explain anything I've actually said. What you've done is create a strawman version of my positions and then attacked that instead of engaging with what I actually believe." The accusation was so accurate, so precisely aimed, that Colbert actually seemed to flinch. But instead of acknowledging the point, he doubled down, his voice becoming harsh and dismissive. "Oh, please. Don't try to turn this into some kind of academic debate about logical fallacies. This is about real-world impact. This is about whether your activism has actually accomplished anything meaningful, or whether it's just been a series of carefully crafted public relations moves designed to enhance your reputation." The cruelty of the statement was breathtaking, but what was worse was the satisfied smirk that played across Colbert's face as he delivered it. He was clearly proud of the attack, clearly pleased with his ability to wound her with words. Portman sat in stunned silence for a moment, as if she couldn't quite process what she'd just heard. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the silent studio with perfect clarity. "You know what, Steve? You win. You've succeeded in making me question everything I believe about decency and good faith communication. You've turned what should have been a conversation about art and storytelling into something ugly and personal. You've used your platform and your power to tear down someone who came here to talk about work they're proud of." She started to stand up, but Colbert wasn't finished. "Running away when things get tough?" he called out, his voice carrying a mocking tone that made several audience members visibly wince. "I guess that answers the question about your commitment to difficult conversations." The comment was so petty, so obviously designed to provoke. her into staying and continuing the conflict, that it had the opposite effect. Portman stood up fully, her posture straight and dignified despite everything that had happened. "I'm not running away from a difficult conversation, Steve. I'm walking away from cruelty disguised as journalism. There's a difference, and the fact that you can't see that difference is deeply concerning." She reached down to remove her microphone, her movements deliberate and controlled. The studio was so quiet that the tiny sound of the mic pack being unclipped seemed to echo across the space. "You want to know what real activism looks like?" she said, her voice now carrying a strength that had been absent earlier in the interview. "Sometimes it looks like refusing to participate in your own degradation. Sometimes it looks like walking away from people who want to tear you down rather than build anything up." Colbert's face was now red with anger and what looked like embarrassment. "So you're just going to leave? You're going to walk out in the middle of an interview because someone asked you challenging questions?" Portman turned to face him directly, and when she spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "Steve, you didn't ask me challenging questions. You attacked my character, questioned my motives, and tried to make me prove my worth to you based on standards that you yourself couldn't meet. That's not journalism. That's not even good television. That's just meanness." She turned toward the edge of the stage, but then paused and looked back at him one more time. "I hope whatever you thought you were going to accomplish tonight was worth it. I hope the clip that goes viral tomorrow, the one where you made an actress cry on national television, brings you the attention you were looking for." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Colbert's mouth opened as if he was going to respond, but no words came out. He seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, how his behavior would look to viewers, how the clips would play on social media, how history would remember this moment. But it was too late. Portman was already walking toward the exit, her head held high, despite everything that had happened. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud or simply sit quietly until someone told them what to do. As she reached the edge of the stage, one audience member started to clap. Then another. Within seconds, a significant portion of the studio audience was applauding her exit, their faces showing a mixture of admiration and sympathy for how she'd handled an impossible situation. Colbert sat in his chair, looking smaller somehow than he had at the beginning of the interview. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like shame. He glanced toward his production team in the wings, as if looking for guidance on how to handle what had just happened. "We'll be right back," he finally managed to say to the cameras, his voice lacking any of its usual energy or charm. But everyone in the studio knew that whatever came next would be anticlimactic. The real story was already over, and it had ended with one of the most dramatic walkouts in late-night television history. The cameras stopped rolling, but the damage was done. In the space of 20 minutes, what should have been a routine promotional appearance had turned into a masterclass in how not to conduct an interview, how not to treat a guest, and how quickly a reputation built over years could be damaged by a single night of poor judgment and cruelty. The silence in the studio was deafening as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. This wasn't just television history. This was a moment that would be studied and discussed for years to come, a perfect example of what happens when power is abused and decency is abandoned in the pursuit of controversy. So, what did you think of this explosive confrontation? Do you believe Portman was right to walk away, or should she have stayed and continued fighting? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that shocked the entertainment world.